Tonight, the 2022 Greater Boston Housing Report Card is out, and the findings, not surprisingly, are bleak, highlighting wealth and race gaps across both renters and home buyers. Two of the people behind the Boston Foundation report join me with some of the biggest problems and potential solutions. Plus, the anatomy of an effective protest from women and some men in Iran calling for regime change after the death of a woman in police custody, to actions here in the U.S. over abortion access, police violence, climate change. Oh, and of course, are those big oil objectors who threw tomato soup on a Van Gogh still glued to the wall? What kind of protests are the most likely to succeed? We've long known housing affordability in and around Boston is a big problem. And a new report out today from the Boston Foundation shows things aren't good on far too many fronts, from high rents to skyrocketing home prices, major racial inequities, and confusing paths to subsidized housing, even for those who qualify, putting affordable housing out of the reach for far too many. As Boston Foundation President and CEO Lee Pelton put it, it's a fragmented process that defies any goals of equity and diversity. So let's dig into the mess and how to fix it. Joining me are Soni Gupta, Associate Vice President of Neighborhoods and Housing at the Boston Foundation. Soni, it's good to have you. Luc Schuster is the Senior Director of Boston Indicators, which is the Boston Foundation's research center. Good to see you too, Luc. Thanks so much for both of you. So let's start with a rare piece of good news. Housing production up last year. You guys calculated the number of permits, I think, was at the highest level since 2005. Why?
I'll turn this over to Luc as a data person.
I mean, I think there has been a growing recognition over the last 5 or 10 years that we have a housing crisis, and there are some communities in the region who are, putting one foot in front of the other and trying to permit new housing production. Big issue we highlight in the report is that those production increases are not even across the region. There's far more, especially multifamily production, happening in metro core communities like Boston, Cambridge, Medford, and much less in the higher income suburbs.
Well, it seems to me from his answer, the good news is where there's a will, they can do it. I mean, what Luc is saying is because people realize there's a crisis, some responded. Is that the conclusion I should draw from that?
Absolutely, and I think some have responded in doing far more of their fair share than others, and our goal is really to have more communities doing more. So for instance, Boston has always produced more, has in many recent years produced a lot more housing, has produced a lot more subsidized housing, and we need more communities.
I want to talk about what Mayor Wu's plans are in a couple of minutes, but a couple of things that are not so good. Obviously, home prices, rents skyrocketing. We'll put up what Zillow did. Boston is the 4th highest rental prices by a lot over D.C. of major metropolitan markets. Another thing I saw this morning put us number 2. Is there anything new in those findings, or are they just more of what we've known before?
I mean, I'd say something that's surprising about those findings is that the pandemic didn't shift the trend very much. The graph you just showed, there was a little bit of dip in rents in mid to late 2020, but that trend reversed really quickly into early 2021, and we're setting record levels again. And it just speaks to the more fundamental structural problem of not building enough for a couple generations.
So that little blip was we went from insanely unaffordable to just really unaffordable. Is that pretty much what it was?
And a lot of that was university students leaving the area during the pandemic year, but coming back a year later.
Okay, one more finding that to me is the most troubling. Could you explain, either of you, what cost burden means? Do you want to do it?
Sure. Cost burden is the ratio of the family's income to their housing costs. So when we say a family's cost burden, we usually mean that they're paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs, which means rent or mortgage payments, as well as the cost of heating their homes.
And your numbers are 45% of all renters are cost burden, Black and Latino renters over 50% cost burden, which basically means, I'll do the obvious translation, you have no money for anything else except to pay your rent.
That's exactly right. You're barely surviving by paying for housing, just to keep a roof over your head.
Is there another I mean, I want to move on to solutions in a minute. Is there another finding I'm ignoring that you think is central to the problem here, Luc?
I mean, related to the cost burden one is we've seen a sharp increase in the number of families living in overcrowded housing. Yeah. Over the last 11 years, basically a 2/3 increase in the number of families living in overcrowded homes region-wide.
Can a question I hesitate to ask, because you're going to look at me and say this guy cannot be as clueless as he appears. Why does supply not keep up with demand in the state? Is that a dumb question?
No, I think it's an important question.
Well,
I mean,
what is the answer?
A bunch of reasons. I'll say there's, I think, one really core reason, which is we have 351 very small cities and towns in Massachusetts, and the state has ceded most of the important, land use and housing decisions to local governments in those cities and towns. And it's meant there's been kind of a race to the bottom in erecting zoning rules that make it illegal to build the dense multifamily housing we need to meet the interest from people to live and work in our region.
Well, Charlie Baker's tried to fix some of that, I would argue. We'll say in a minute. One of the things that's most troubling about all this is that it doesn't take an expert on research to realize that the most important part of most families' wealth is their home. And I've talked to your colleague, Lee Pelton, ad nauseum about the wealth gap study out of the Federal Reserve several years ago. I know you're partners in an effort to update it in the next couple of years. This is the infamous $250,000 for a white family, $8, and that's right, $8 for a black family. Some Latino families even lower at $0. This is the major contributing problem to that gap, is it not? The housing problem?
Absolutely, and it's housing. Not just ownership housing, it's rental housing, because if you look at the demographics, more Black and Latino households are renters, so any intervention towards addressing the racial wealth gap must look at renters. And actually today's report looked at how many renter households are left out of home ownership because of just even over the last 2 years, the increases in home prices and now the interest rate increase, and how more and more households are unable to even become home buyers, so even begin to start to build an asset.
Well, also, not only can they not become home buyers, but by definition, that increases the demand for rental housing if they can't buy.
That's
so
right.
Obviously rental prices go up as well. Can you share with us a couple of the recommendations in this report, each of you will ask, that you think are most important, but they have to pass the laugh test? I mean, things that are actually achievable in this kind of political environment. Give me one or two that you think matter, Luke.
I'll give one framework for thinking about solutions, which is I think we need to do more of this at a regional or state level scale. So efforts like the MBTA communities upzoning law that was passed a year and a half ago by the legislature, that's expecting most communities in Greater Boston to adopt one neighborhood zone that allows for multifamily housing construction.
This is one of the Baker plans, 175 communities. Am I not right about this?
The vast majority of Eastern Massachusetts. And it's just saying, anybody that has some access to a transit node in the region, you've got to have at least one modest portion of your community that allows for something other than just single-family homes to be built. And I think that kind of shared collective approach is what we've really been lacking to date.
And a lot of resistance to that in some communities, though, yes?
And it speaks to the kind of path dependence where, again, we have, local planning boards, local town meetings that have been empowered with making these really critical housing decisions for so long, but that's not how people live. People live and work regionally. People are moving across these town boundaries all the time, and so that's why I think we got to level up a lot of our policy solutions.
Well, Baker also changed ultimately. Did he not win that zoning percentage approval thing, which obviously is pretty significant too? What would you add to that list of recommendations that does pass the laugh test, Soni?
I'd say what we push for in this report, some sort of a fair housing initiative at the state level.
What would that mean?
That would mean an Office of Fair Housing with a senior administration person making decisions about and looking at data across the state to see what kinds of interventions we need to do at a state level.
I mean, Maura Healey's the front runner and the likely next governor. I know a lot of people haven't voted yet. We just started voting this past weekend. I know she seems to embrace, at least it seems to me, this transit hub thing that Baker did. She also seems to be she'll be with us on the radio tomorrow. We're going to talk about this a little bit. She also seems to be supportive of some sort of subsidy for low-income renters and first-time home buyers. Am I right about that?
Yes, and I think that could be an incredible push at the state level, is to look at what it takes to make housing affordable for lower income households. We're actually looking at a statewide increase in the Massachusetts state rental voucher program to make it more of a right or a program that's available to any household that might be income eligible. So what would it take to make housing affordable for all households?
You don't wade into the rent control debate, do you, in this report?
Not in this report, no. I mean, to me, so the state of Oregon passed the statewide rent stabilization. They're calling it rent stabilization, not rent control. What I like about that kind of model is
that's because politicians think that's less offensive to people who are scared, by the way. I used to be a rent control lawyer in New York City, so go ahead.
Fair enough. But the key piece I'd flag there is they did that and paired it with really meaningful statewide upzoning to effectively end single-family exclusive zoning statewide in Oregon, allowing at least duplexes on any individual plot of land. So you got to do strategies like that, I think, together.
One last thing about that. My understanding, I'm quite sure that Maura Healey has told us on the radio in the past that she ultimately said she would support the local option rent control bill that is pending in the legislature, meaning no mandate for a community, but permission. If you want to impose a local option rent control plan, however you design it, you can do that. Are you hopeful, or how do you come out of this report?
Well, hopeful in the sense that there seems to be some very doable, like you said, laugh test passing solutions, and with a new administration and the data to support it, I think we have some potential to make some inroads. And I think like the local option, for instance, seems like a logical solution. There are communities that actually want to look at rent control and should be able to. And
someday somebody will explain to me why a legislature should not vote unanimously for any permission for a city and town if what they do doesn't affect anybody beyond their borders. Shouldn't be able to do it. Were you in the hopeful scale? Obviously not as high as your colleague.
No, I actually do think that the permitting numbers you cited are positive over the last 5 or 10 years. That's good news. I think the policy steps that the state has taken in the last 2 years are promising. The thing I'm worried about is, are we going to wait for our housing crisis to get as bad as it was in California to really take action? I mean, California on the legislative side is really lapping us now. Every year, session after session, they're going back, passing new laws. They've legalized the construction of accessory dwelling units statewide. So that, it's neat to see what they're doing there. I'm worried they're taking those actions because their crisis is sort of another big degree worse than ours, and I'd hate for ours to have to get there before we do more at scale.
Luc, thank you so much. Good to see you.
Thanks,
congratulations on your work. Soni, same to you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. You can find the full Boston Foundation Housing Report Card online at tbf.org. And you can find much more on the housing crisis in Massachusetts in our ongoing series at gbhnews.org/priced out. Mourners and protesters are marking 40 days since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died while in the custody of Iran's morality police. And despite deadly government crackdowns, demonstrations against the regime are still going strong across the country. But how likely are they to spark real change? Data coming out of Harvard finds the odds are not in their favor. As the lead researcher put it, nonviolent campaigns are seeing the lowest success rates in more than a century, with around 1 in 6 protests leading to some sort of systemic change over the last few years, compared to 2 in 3 finding success in the early 2000s. The researcher went on to say, for the first time since the 40s, a decade dominated by state-backed partisan rebellions against Nazi occupations, nonviolent resistance does not have a statistically significant advantage over armed insurrection. So does soup throwing stand a better chance? What kind of protest is likely to lead to real change and what is not? Could some of that power lie in the arts? I'm joined by Stephen Duncombe. He's a professor and co-founder and research director for the Center for Artistic Activism at NYU. We'd intended to have Black Lives Matter activist DeRay McKesson, who co-founded Campaign Zero, with us. Unfortunately, he was unable to join at the very last moment. Stephen, good to meet you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Pretty provocative headline in The Guardian in a piece you wrote. The soup protesters, and I assume people know those were those who threw tomato soup at the Van Gogh at the National Gallery and then glued themselves to the wall. The soup protesters grabbed the world's attention, but were they effective? How did you answer the question? Were they effective?
Well, it's too soon to know. But my real question is, what was their objective? When we work with activists, the key thing we work with is, okay, well, we have a goal, right? And this clearly just stop oil. But what is the objective of the action? What was actually trying to be done by the action? What do you want people to do? And who is your audience? And what do you want that audience to think, feel, and do? I mean, here we are, 2 weeks later, and we're still talking about the action. And we're not talking about the fact that unless we get rid of carbon-based fuels, we're going to exterminate human life on this planet. And I think that is problematic when you talk about the action and not actually what the objective of the action might be or the goal of the action.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, unless, and I have no idea if they do, if they have a longer term plan. If sort of step one was to crack people's minds open, and then maybe next step. The only analogy I can think of is most people I talked to were appalled by this soup throwing. And by the way, it should be clear, I think there's plexiglass or something in front. I'm not defending it, but it wasn't on the Van Gogh itself. And I sort of analogize it to how I remember people responding to PETA maybe a decade or so ago. It's outrageous. They're throwing red paint on women in expensive furs. All we're talking about is the red paint. Well, it took a while, but down the line, a lot of communities said no to fur. My hometown of Cambridge is just voting on it this week or last or something like that. So if it's part of a continuum of action, maybe the fact that we only know about the soup now is not such a horrible thing, no?
Perhaps. I mean, and we will see. And if it's not part of a larger campaign, then it really won't be effective. And that's true for any sort of activist intervention. But I think what PETA had going for it, and I'm not the biggest fan of PETA's actions, I'll put that out there, but what PETA had going for it was that there was a direct connection between the action and the message.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Which was, you are wearing a fur. A fur is taken from an animal who bleeds, right? The connection between throwing tomato soup at a Van Gogh painting of a sunflower to protest oil is so convoluted that the legibility factor, which is absolutely essential in any sort of activist action, you want your audience to know what you're about, and you want them to know what they can do to act upon it. That gets lost.
I think convoluted is being kind, actually, frankly, but I think you were being kind. So what does make a successful protest? And are there common threads through all of them, actually, whether they're, again, millions of people on the street for Black Lives Matter after Michael Brown was killed, beginning, and then obviously after George Floyd, to small demonstrations about other things that matter. Is there a common thread?
Yeah, I think so. My go-to examples are always from the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, because they were actually really brilliant at thinking tactics. Let's just take a very famous one, Rosa Parks refusing to get up her seat on a bus in Montgomery in 1955. Now, what was so brilliant about that is the action itself communicated what the message was, which is the right of African Americans to sit wherever they want on a bus. So that's number one. Number two, it was part of a larger campaign. It was kicking off the campaign, but it was a fully worked out campaign that included other civil rights leaders, the Black churches, and had a method towards desegregation, which was going to be the bus boycott. They thought about their audiences, both African Americans in Montgomery, which they wanted to get to join the bus boycott. They also thought about a wider American audience, which might not care about the policies of white supremacy. And very importantly, they thought about U.S. being in competition with the Soviet Union at that time on a worldwide stage over who was going to bear the mantle of peace and justice. And those images played into all of that.
But there are a lot of successful efforts that are not nearly as well thought out, nor as impactful. I mean, just this week, Adidas dropped Kanye West, and he went from a billionaire down to a mere, whatever it is, $400 million. Adidas didn't do it purely because they're a socially responsible corporation. They took a huge amount of crap. So what common thread that you see in successful protests was there that led to that outcome?
Well, I mean, you know, what they had a fear of is a boycott, okay? And so boycotting can be a very, very successful tactic. I think of United Farm Workers in the 1970s. You know, my parents wouldn't buy grapes, they wouldn't buy lettuce. And it was brilliant because it took this abstraction of a labor struggle across all these fields in California and brought it to a centralized place. And very importantly, gave people something to do. My parents could support the farm workers way out in California by not buying lettuce and not buying grapes.
By the way, I had Dolores Huerta here not too long ago, and it's so thrilling. It is unbelievable. Are you surprised that there was not, I mean, the women's marches after the day after the inauguration of Trump were huge, absolutely huge. I have to say, I was stunned by the fact that there was not a national upheaval of women and men after the Dobbs decision repealing Roe. Were you surprised? And why do you think there was that lack? I mean, there were demonstrations outside the Supreme Court and isolated demonstrations around the country, but nothing huge. Why?
Well, I think this goes back to explaining a little bit about the actions of the Just Stop Oil activists, is that one of the problems, the sort of tried and true, methods of the march, the rally, the petition, is they've been done so much they've become routinized. They become every day. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when they come every day, they don't have that capacity to make us stop and think and reevaluate. And so I applaud this idea of thinking about creative new ways of actions. I mean, that's what we do at the Center for Artistic Activism. We get people to try to create like artists when they go into their activism as a way to offer surprise and shake people up and make it so they can't just dismiss it as, oh, that's just another march. That's just another rally. So I think that explains a little bit of that sort of the shock value that those protesters that threw the tomato soup. The problem is even as you're striving to be new, you do have to think about old things like, what's your objective? Who's your audience? Is this going to resonate with them and pass your message through? So, but I think that, the old models have to constantly be recreated.
Indeed. Do you know if they're still glued to the wall, Stephen, or do you not know?
No, I imagine they got them out.
Stephen Duncombe, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
That's it for tonight. Please come back tomorrow as we continue our series on the Boston Globe's 5-star rated restaurants with chef and owner of Nightshade in Lynn. And I cannot wait to sample some of their 14-course offerings. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you for watching. And of course, please don't forget Ukraine.
I'm deep in the Lynn Woods, inside the belly of the beast, Dungeon Rock. Some say that this place is seriously haunted. Do you worry that it's actually haunted?
For sure. Yes, absolutely.
Others that it hides the treasure of 17th century pirate Thomas Veal.
He's in the cave, the treasure's in the cave, and he's smashed flat. So this rock becomes his dungeon.
One thing that is certain, it was dug by a man who believed he was being led right here from beyond the grave. So there is a supposedly haunted cave here in Lynn. We're gonna get to the bottom of this spooky story, and our quest begins right here.
I grew up not too far from the woods. We definitely learned about Dungeon Rock as kids, for sure. It's a pretty cool and compelling story.
In the mid-1800s, the woods entered an ominous chapter, becoming a hotbed of the paranormal, thanks to a Massachusetts man named Hiram Marble, a member of a social religious movement called spiritualism.
They had mediums that believed that they could speak to people that have passed on, and so Hiram Marble would use these mediums.
Marble purchased the land in Lynn Woods because he believed he was being led there by one spirit in particular, the ghost of a pirate from the 1600s named Thomas Veal.
Stories have it that there was a pirate who ended up taking up shop there, hiding with his treasure. An earthquake happened and he was sealed in the cave with the treasure, allegedly.
The pirate story first appeared in print nearly 2 centuries after it supposedly happened, and soon versions began popping up all over. And it was against this backdrop that Hiram Marble and his son Edwin would spend 30 years relentlessly digging a cave in search of the remains of Thomas Veal and his buried treasure, a cave still there today, Dungeon Rock.
Would you be interested in joining me for a little trip to the pirate cave?
There are a lot of people who still go to Dungeon Rock. I'm just not one of them.
Wait, you've never been inside?
No.
Why?
It creeps me out a little bit.
Do you worry that it's actually haunted? Like, do you?
Yeah, for sure.
For sure?
Yes, absolutely. I don't need to encounter that spirit.
At the edge of the woods, today a 2,200-acre park, we met up with Ranger Dan Small, our guide into the heart of Hiram Marble's unholy obsession. There was no turning back now.
There are people who won't go in. At one time, 20 years ago, I had an assistant ranger, and he was a rugged guy. He was like a regular guy, but he would not go in there.
As the original story goes, one night in 1658, a mysterious ship appeared in the bay. 4 men, including Thomas Veal, were seen rowing from it up the Saugus River. They took up residency in the woods.
And he had the treasure with him, which is the important part.
3 of the pirates were captured by authorities, but Thomas Veal escaped.
He ran up into here with the treasure. Behind this big rock that you're standing next to, there's actually a natural cave.
And there he lived for a time, until a great earthquake struck and collapsed his makeshift abode.
That's why it's called Dungeon Rock. This is the pirate's dungeon, because a big boulder has him trapped underneath it.
As for the veracity of this old yarn,
There were pirates in this area at that time. There really was a guy named Tom Veal. There's records of him in the Salem court.
But while there are first-hand records of earthquakes here in 1638 and 1663, there wasn't one in 1658.
Another major fault with the story, too, is nowhere before about 1850 or 1840 is there any reference to this area being called Dungeon Rock.
True or not, Hiram Marble wholeheartedly believed the tale. As for people today,
I've found ritually killed chickens. I've found things with candles and coconut and all sorts of things that were set up. It's easy to dismiss it all as a hoax or hooey, but the reality is a lot of people still believe that there's something going on up here, and who am I to say there isn't?
out of excuses and reasons to stall, it was time to enter this literal underworld. Inside, it is cold, it is damp, and it is dark. The tunnel is erratic.
They actually would hold seances in the cave. The ghost would appear, and he would say, go right, go left, and that's why it makes these abrupt changes.
And it abruptly ends, 174 feet from the start, with 2 stagnant pools of water.
We got a trusty ghost meter here. It runs on a 9-volt battery, so I'm not sure how much of a ghost meter it can really be, but we're gonna turn it on and see what we find here at the end of the cave. All right. The needle seems to be doing absolutely nothing in any direction. Oh, a little bounce here. What, honestly, what the was that?
Turns out it was just some kids messing with us.
Like that was legitimately for a moment terrifying.
In the end, there were no ghosts, there was no gold. A disappointment I think the Marbles might relate to. Hiram passed away in 1868. Edwin kept digging until his death in 1880 and is buried in an unmarked grave just steps from the cave's entrance. They didn't find the treasure either, but in a way, they did get what they were looking for.
Edwin and Hiram's plan from the start, and they made this very public, was that if they ever found the money, they were going to buy all this land around here and they were going to turn it into a park for the people in Lynn.
Today, it is exactly that, and their man-made cave at Dungeon Rock is free and open to the public whenever the weather allows. So yes, you can come and see it for yourself if you dare.
The Curiosity Desk is sponsored by Emerson College, inspiring curiosity and creative expression in all of us.